Hello everyone, and welcome to Château d'Aneo, an 18th century chateau that we acquired at the end of April 2023, just 4 months ago. We're in Burgundy, an hour from Dijon, an hour from Auxerre, and it's a chateau that had been abandoned for 40 years. So we decided to take over this estate of 5 hectares or so to live in it, to restore it. There's a lot to do, and above all, to open it to the public. The aim is to open the gardens, which are the most beautiful part of the estate, so that visitors can admire the various 18th century buildings, and to open the gardens to the public as of next summer. So this chateau is 18th century, the first part of the 18th century, built perhaps, we'll talk about it again, but on a former manor house from what we're beginning to understand as the late 17th century. And it therefore comprises a central building, the chateau, and the outbuildings, dwellings, stables, barns, which we'll have a chance to discover in a moment. I invite you to follow me to discover the Grand Staircase, which has been listed as a historic monument since 1984, along with the first salon. In fact, these are the only 2 rooms to be listed as historic monuments. The buildings, the roofs, the facades, everything is listed. Every single construction in the park is listed as a historic monument, but inside we have just 2 rooms that I invite you to discover now. Before showing you the Grand Staircase, I'd like to talk a little about the facade. The facade is asymmetrical, as I was saying, with one part probably dating from the late 17th century, an old manor house, and another part, an extension, the tower, the staircase tower, and the whole part inside, which is more mid-18th century. In the Grand Staircase, you'll see some of the old openings that have been uncovered on the exterior facades, but which are now inside this 17th century section. So here we are at the foot of the Grand Staircase, but first of all, before climbing it, I invite you to discover the room on the left, which is semi-buried. These are the old 18th century kitchens, and well worth a look. So here we are in the 18th century kitchen, a classic vaulted room found in many chateaux, with a stone sink, a rather classic shape, a large fireplace. This kitchen was probably used until the 19th century. It's extended a little to the right and left by various cellars, wine cellars, ancestors of the fridge, in other words, for storing food. And then we had reconstructions of more recent 19th century kitchens upstairs. So now we're going to be able to discover the Grand Staircase I've told you so much about, which is adorned with 2 purely decorative pilasters. They have no architectural function whatsoever and are purely decorative. The same pilasters can be found on the staircase of a former high school in the town of Avalon from the same period, and then there's this wrought iron gate typical of the 18th century, and the wall you see at the back is actually 5 centimeters thick. It's a horizontal stone cladding. It's not a load-bearing wall at all, but we can talk about that later. I told you that there was an old building, probably a former manor house on the Seigneurie d'Aneo, which was acquired by the Champion family and then enlarged into a chateau. Well, as proof of this window was uncovered by the former owners when they staked out the walls, probably in the 80s and 90s. You can clearly see that we were on an exterior wall with a window, the second window of which was transformed into a door. And you'll see a peculiarity found in many of the chateau's rooms, namely the use of optical illusion, particularly with regard to the doors. Here, in fact, we have a wall with only half a door, and it's been clad in woodwork to give the impression that there was a double door, as in the more 18th century section we'll see next. So, here we are in the oldest part of the chateau, probably once again this former manor house, and we can see that this is where we find the oldest Louis XV style woodwork, which is only on the garden facade, so we don't know if there were others before. We may find out later, but for the moment we don't have the information. The other part of the castle has been reworked in terms of woodwork and is more in the Louis XVI style, as we'll discover in a moment. So, second bedroom, second living room, I'd like to draw your attention to an inscription above the fireplace, Urbex Dijon. So yes, it's a chateau that was, as I was saying, abandoned for 40 years, and much visited by Urbex, but also by other communities who came to squat in the Château. So it hasn't been too badly damaged. It's more that time has damaged it, the fact that it's open to the four winds, water infiltration. But you can still find the parquet floors, the fireplaces. It hasn't been looted as some castles unfortunately sometimes are. I invite you to follow me to a rear section overlooking a courtyard, which was probably added in the 19th century. And I'll show you, if we have time, in the attic framework, how this section was extended with two small, more 19th century rooms in the treatment. Here's a room of no particular architectural interest, and now we're going into a much darker room. I'm going to try and shed a little light on it because we can't see much. You'll see the state of the room. We removed the props a week ago because we realized they weren't holding anything anymore, so they were useless. They were more dangerous than anything else, but that doesn't mean the ceiling is holding on its own. It's going to fall soon, and there's a lot of work to be done on the framework on the top. It obviously deteriorated in the end, even the parquet floors. You've got the castle safe, so I'll say this for Urbexes and other visitors, it's empty, we don't have the key, but it's been opened, so not by me, but by others at the back, and it's empty. And in fact, we arrive at the back of the grand staircase at the foot of a collimated staircase, which is more a service staircase as it was in the 18th century, obviously separating the owners, the châtelains, the seigneurs from the small staff. And so here we are. We'll use this service staircase later when we visit the first floor. So this time we have a double door. We didn't need to truncate the 17th century architecture since we're on the 18th century construction. And so we have this double door that opens onto an enfilade of two salons, and we're now in the first salon. And it's this salon that has been listed as a monument historique since 1984, without really knowing why, because the second is just as beautiful. It has a Louis XV mantelpiece, and I mentioned the straighter Louis XVI woodwork, which is certainly not the original woodwork, but it does have a Louis XV shell mantelpiece. Here you have a 19th century overmantel that we dismantled, and I'll show you in the other lounge later, which, according to old photos, was fitted with an overmantel mirror in the directoire style, but it's worth noting that there are traces of it underneath. It's quite pretty. From the first drawings, and here in the hollow of the hook of a plaster molding, which has now disappeared. We're doing a bit of archaeology in the chateau because we're actually trying to scrape around to find out about the original paintings, to find out what was under the woodwork or how the old woodwork was placed. It was by searching in the attic, by digging behind mattresses, by emptying the attic, we'll see later, that we were able to discover, for example, these two magnificent Louis XVI style overmantels from the 18th century. There are two representations of the seasons. Here we have the grape harvest, which is quite classic, and here the harvest. We don't know if there were the other two seasons, winter and spring, and whether the overmantels have disappeared. We don't even know where they should be placed, on which chimney. We haven't found the location yet. What's unusual about 18th century overmantels is that they're unfinished. In the 18th century, woodwork was often painted, and here you have blue, for example. The first blue, the first color that was uncovered by dismantling the overmantel I showed you in the next room. So here too we have the first paintings. There are no other paintings underneath. And here you have these unpainted overmantels. And again, the overmantels were painted, were gilded, and these are rough. It's one of the mysteries of the chateau. There are others, but perhaps they were never installed. You have a beautiful double-level marble fireplace with green marble, rather green on the back and rather pink on the front. And you can see the general state of the chateau's rooms if you look up and see what the various seepages have caused, and the fact that the roofs haven't been replaced, that the roofs have not been maintained for over 40 years. So now we enter the dining room, more 19th, which replaces the 18th century kitchen we had here. This is a typical 19th century dining room niche. We can also see that there are some minor structural problems that I mentioned, which we'll come across again when we visit the upstairs bedroom with care, since we have some structural problems to deal with. A final small salon whose use has not yet been determined. Well, we know what we're going to do with it, but its original use has not yet been determined. Since it's rather narrow, it adjoins the dining room. Next, we'll discover a corridor that leads to the first floor via a grand staircase, but obviously less noble than the one we've seen, since it's made of wood. And I'll take you through a small passage because in the same spirit of the columnated staircase that was hidden behind the grand stone staircase, you also have small passages that obviously served the dining room and provided access to a more 19th century kitchen that was later built onto the courtyard. There you have it, little corridors with no treatment, no woodwork, just like you'll find here. So here we are in the last bay of the Château. We are in the L-shaped section. We are in a section I'll show you later when we'll see the exteriors that were at ground level, meaning that the ground was actually sloping and the Château was built to follow the shape of the land. We entered via this grand staircase, found ourselves on the first floor, and finally when we reached the end of the salons, well, we're on the ground floor overlooking the flower beds, which were French flower beds in the 18th century, but which have obviously been transformed somewhat over the centuries. So here you have a more classic wooden staircase, which is a bit of an illusion because it's actually from 1950, since it was built by the previous owners to serve the upstairs when it was converted into a bedroom. I'd just like to draw your attention to this architectural feature we've already seen at the top of the staircase. When we opened onto a new kitchen on the courtyard, we only created a half door. The opening is only the size of a half door, and we clad it in the same way to give the illusion that there was a double door and to keep a little of the masterly aspect. Once again, it's a half-level chateau in the 18th century style, so the noble floor is raised, but it's not a first floor or a ground floor, it's in between the two, and here we have a 19th century attic conversion of no great architectural interest. We have a large corridor that leads to 4 or 5 bedrooms, and we're going to walk past it quite quickly. Instead, I'm going to take you to the attics, where we discovered the over-mantel I mentioned earlier. So here's a first corridor in the L-shaped section of the building, and then we come to the corridor on the main facade overlooking the common areas and gardens. Once again, the rooms aren't of much interest, but I'll just show you the last one, the tower room, which is the oldest, and you can see it in the woodwork, as there are remnants of the woodwork on the door, the window frame, the cupboard, and even the fireplace in pure 18th century style. We're back in pure 18th century style. Remember, on the lower part of the room, apart from the oldest part, we were using Louis XVI style woodwork. And so, with this style of woodwork and perhaps the most beautiful view of the chateau as we look out over the Avallonnaise countryside and villages in the distance. So we leave the tower room, and as I was saying, remember we're on the first floor under the slope, we're under the roof, the attic, which has been converted into a bedroom, and now we're going to enter the attic of the oldest part, the first part we saw when we entered the chateau. This part has not been converted, so we'll be able to see the 18th century or even 17th century roof frameworks. Just a few weeks ago, we entered an attic where nothing had been moved for almost 300 years, where for 300 years we had piled up everything we no longer wanted, and we're gradually starting to sort it out. Everything in the center will go to the dump, but we're trying to keep a little, there's no real treasure, but we're trying to keep a little souvenir through objects of what life might have been like at the Château in the 18th and 19th centuries. I'm going to show you 2 or 3 anecdotal items that are here to be sorted. We have Asian umbrellas, we have grandfather's old rifle, which may have been hidden at one time, and then we found this cane that shines well. It's not gold, it's pompon, an alloy of copper and silver, I believe, and the aim was to imitate gold. It comes from the Hôtel de Pompon in Paris, where the craftsmen who hammered and worked this metal had obtained the privilege of doing so and using the name of the hotel. And on top is the Goupillot's coat of arms, perhaps not visible here, but one of the families who owned the Château in the 19th century. Here some hat boxes, old trunks in which we find labels with the Parisian addresses of the former owners. Now we're doing a bit of genealogy, trying to trace the history of the Château through the history of its owners. And that's when you realize that this is a Château that has been passed down, not in a direct line, but rather through nephews and nieces. Rather, it's a Château that's inherited rather than passed down through the, shall we say, eldest branch. And it's more of a country Château. It's more like a hunting lodge, a country Château that you don't live in permanently. This also explains the internal architecture, the absence of 19th century sanitary facilities. And then there's the fact that a lot of attention was paid to the exterior when the Château was first built, but that after that, little was done to embellish and modify it to make it more habitable over the course of the century. So there's quite a lot to do, and we're going to get down to it from now on. I now invite you to take the spiral staircase we saw behind the grand staircase, or rather the service staircase, which will take us back to the back of this grand staircase.
We're now at the back of the tower in this rather narrow staircase. Quite narrow, quite steep.
So now we've just about finished the tour of the Château, which I didn't mention is about 500 square meters in size. And I'm going to tell you a little about the park, the gardens, and above all the project we have around these gardens, since, as I was saying earlier, we're going to open them to visitors from next summer. As we know from the archives, there used to be a low wall with a few steps leading up to a straight parterre à la française. Today, the park is more of a 19th century design, more of an English park, with a magnificent cedar of Lebanon and a purple cedar, and more of the species found in 19th century English parks, which are less orderly. Our aim is to create an in-between space where we'll try to keep the wild, untamed aspect while bringing a little order to the central area, perhaps taking inspiration from gardens such as the Plume Garden with taller, wilder grasses. It'll be a mix of all that, and as you explore the gardens, you'll discover the architecture and history of the estate in relation to the seigneurie of Agneau, Avalon, and the region. The park has 2 special features, even 3. These are doors that have never been opened, dating back to the Rococo style, in which the rock imitates a hollowed-out stone that has been underwater. The pediments of these doors are adorned with mascarons, sometimes grimacing, sometimes smiling, to ward off evil spirits, a little welcoming or repulsive, depending on distance from the Château. 4 of them are mirrored on either side. The second special feature of the park, behind this cedar, is a miraculous fountain, a listed historic monument linked to the history of Saint-Gengould. Saint-Gengould is an 8th century saint, and I'll tell you the story briefly, but he's a bit like the Saint of Cuckolds, since he goes off to war for Pepin le Bref, and when he comes back, his wife Ganea has cheated on him, so he decides to put her to the water test. By dipping her hand in a fountain, she comes out with a burned arm, so he has proof that she's been unfaithful. She decided to complain to her lover, who decided to murder her husband, and finally, over the centuries, the legend was transformed, and today he's more of a saint linked to the treatment of dermatological problems and women who can't have children. So it's likely that Saint-Gengould didn't die here as legend has it, even if it wasn't very far away on the Langres Plateau, a few dozen kilometers. In the tradition of the 18th century, when building his castle, the bourgeois of Avalon, who was a former innkeeper, who bought a seigneury, who ennobled himself a little by buying land and offices, also wanted to put a bit of legend, certainly, around his castle by having a fountain erected and dedicating it to the saint, who was a bit fashionable at the time. And the last thing you'll see in the park, on this part that can be seen in the distance, are these pillars of statues. It's a greenery cabinet. It's magnificent, dating from the 18th century. It's a sort of colonnade, a little oval-shaped, with carved stone tables in the center, where women would certainly come to chat, do a bit of embroidery, and so we had a whole set of sculptures or fire pots overhanging these colonnades. Today the sculptures are missing, but unfortunately we have a few photos. We're trying to do a little archaeology here too to find out what it was like back then. I'd now like to invite you to take a look at the dovecote, which is one of the buildings of the Commons. This dovecote has 1,300 boulins, the holes where the pigeons used to nest, and we know that dovecotes had two functions at the time. The first was to collect columbine, the pigeon's fennel, since it's a natural fertilizer, and the second was obviously to have meat available at all times and to be able to eat meat every day. So a little historical and mathematical anecdote about pigeons. You need 1 boulin to cover 50 airs. Today we have 1,300 boulins, so we know that with this number of boulins we can cover an area of 650 hectares. And 650 hectares, that's 6.5 square kilometers. That's the surface area of the village we're in, the village of Anéau. So we have proof when the texts tell us that Sir Champion has the seigneury of Anéau, that he is indeed buying the entire territory. I'm now passing under an 18th century gate, also listed as a historic monument, with its stylized fleur-de-lis, which also serves to demarcate, in a purely 18th century logic of class separation, the part for the commons and the part for the seigneurs. Between the two, you'll also find this gate. This grate, which is partly a copy of the grate in the orangery at Versailles, topped with fire pots, and once again separates well the lord and the commoners that were living in the commons. By the way, I'd like to show you a well whose cover has unfortunately been broken off. It's a monolithic cover that was probably put in at a time when the well was connected to this fountain, so there was no need to pour a bucket into it. This well also has the particularity of being a cutaway. We think, as some historians tell us, that the well is quite old, probably older than the 18th century, as is this dwelling, the dwelling part of the outbuildings, and perhaps these parts already went with the manor house, the right-hand part of the Château we spoke about earlier. A word on the commons. You have 3 buildings, and I often like to say that there is growth and decline. You have growth in the size of the buildings. The dwelling is smaller than the stables, which are themselves smaller with their scullery and stalls than the great common with its barns and woodshed, and you have decline in the architectural style. The dwelling for a common dwelling is rather well decorated with dormer windows adorned with stylized breadsticks. As you move on to the stables, you'll see the same dormer windows, but there's no longer any work on the pediment. And finally, as you move on to the main common, there are no dormer windows at all. Inside the stable building, there's a scullery, which still has, even if part of the roof is collapsing, but it still has these doors. These doors are in their original state. It's quite moving. We're going to try to restore all that. It's not the priority, obviously, but we're going to try to do as much as we can. And between the dwelling and this stable building, you have a gate, also 18th century, surmounted by a Sacred Heart, and then you can see it from behind, but a small lion cub. There was a bigger one. It wasn't the same. You can tell from the photo on the right. It's been lost or stolen. We don't know. And here's an 18th century gate that also closed off this courtyard of the outbuildings, providing separate access from the main entrance to the Château. I'm delighted to have introduced you to the Aneo estate and its Château, its history. You can find the progress of the project, all the information relating to the events we can organize, the Heritage Days a few days ago, sometimes events in the park, on our website chateauano.fr, and then on the social networks, mainly Instagram and Facebook, Château d'Aneo. I thank you.